Welcome back, guys. In today's video, we're going to talk all about setting. What is setting? Why is it important? And how can you write a great setting for your novel? What's up, guys? Dave Jacobson here, best-selling author and book publisher. In today's video, we're going to take a look at step number 7 in my story development process. Specifically, we're going to talk all about setting. If you're just joining us in this video series, this is a multi-video series where I'm teaching you step by step exactly what you need to do in order to write a great, fantastic fictional novel. So if that sounds good, guys, without further ado, I'm going to shrink my melon-sized head here, and we're going to get right into today's video. So as you can see here, I've pulled up on the screen a step-by-step story development process. Now, this is a process that I developed over decades of writing books, and this works, guys. Just to give you a quick anecdote, my first novel probably took me 5 years or so to write. My most recent novel, which I recently finished drafting, took me 2.5 months to draft the entire 85,000-word novel. So if you've never written a book before, that might not mean much to you, but if you've ever tried to write a book, then you know that that's a very short amount of time. And the way that I've done that is by using and applying the principles that I'm teaching you now, using this step-by-step story development process. So before we get into setting, which is the topic of this video, I just want to kind of bring you up to speed in case you're just joining us, what this process is, right? This is a step-by-step process that's going to help you draft a novel from start to finish. And there's a method to the madness. You have to go step by step in order for this process to really work. So in the first video, we talked about title, okay? I know it sounds a little bit counterintuitive, but the first step in this process is to come up with a working title for your novel. The reason for this, that we start with this, is number one, because your title is actually the most important text associated with your book. It's the first thing anyone ever notices. It's the make or break decision point where people will actually pick up your novel and read it or not, right? So it's important. It's very important to have at least a good working title in your mind when you start writing a book. The second reason we start with this is by having a title, it severely narrows the focus of what you're working on, right? Which is great for eliminating writer's block and actually tailoring your creative energies in a very specific direction. So for our project, we're actually writing a novel together as I'm teaching you these steps, right? For our particular project that we're working on, as an example, I have chosen the title Dead and Breakfast, okay? And I went into detail. Check out video 1 if you want to learn a lot more about what makes a good title, etc. I also have a video in my channel about titles, so check that out if you're interested. Then we moved on to step 2, right? The second video, we talked about defining your protagonist and antagonist. Okay, I'm not going to rehash that. If you don't know what a protagonist or an antagonist is, or how to think about those and define those, check out the video number 2 in this series, which will teach you all about that. Then we moved on to step number 3, just giving them a working name. So we've chosen Callie as our protagonist and the Department of Spectral Affairs as our antagonist. Then we went on to step 4 and we gave our protagonist some likable and easy to relate to qualities to make them a sympathetic hero. Then we moved on to step 5. We stated the conflict. And step 6, which was the last video that I published in this series, we defined the premise of our story. Okay, so I'm going to read over the premise real quickly so in case you weren't watching that video, you'll know exactly the story that we're currently developing together. And then we're going to get into step 7, which is the opening setting. We're going to talk all about setting, what it is, why it's important, etc. Okay, so the premise for this example that we're working on together is this. When a young dead tween learns that the Department of Spectral Affairs has deported her parents to Hades, she must fight to get them back. Okay? So this tween, or this teen, however we want to think about it, we're writing a middle grade for this particular example, so we can say tween, but it can be any age, obviously. But what's going on here is our protagonist is a young girl. Her parents run this dead and breakfast, hence the title of the novel. And basically, that's a place where all of these dead guests can stay, right? And but there's also living guests living in the same building. So we've got a lot of potential conflict there in the premise right away, right? But something happens where the Department of Spectral Affairs is going to shut down or try to shut down this Scare B&B or Dead and Breakfast. And the parents are deported to Hades, right? Because they're not managing it properly or something happens. We haven't determined that yet because we haven't gotten to the step of developing the plot. We've just developed the premise. But that's what the story is about that we're working on together, okay? But you can obviously work on your own project at home following these steps. So now we're going to get into step 7, which is really the heart of this video, okay? And we're going to talk about setting. You have to, before you can draft a word of your first chapter, you need to know what is the opening setting of your book, okay? You don't have to know every setting. And let's talk about that for a minute, because a lot of people haven't thought about this point, but there's not one setting for a novel. There's actually many settings, right? Let's think about, for example, we're talking about Harry Potter a lot in this series as an example, to use as examples when we're going through the steps. Well, think about Harry Potter, right? The opening setting is on Privet Drive, right? In a house in a neighborhood. But by the middle of the book, the setting's taking place maybe in Harry's dorm room or in the castle, right, where the school is located. So that's just to point out to you that there's actually many different settings in most fictional novels. But what we're really going to focus on for step 7 here is developing the opening setting for your story, because you can't start writing your story until you know that, right? So what is a setting? First, let's define that for those who may not know. And let's carefully think about it, right? Because it's important in order to complete the step that you know what you're talking about. So in a fictional novel, right, setting refers to the time and place where a story or the story unfolds. Importantly, it's not just the location, right? It's also the time. It also encompasses not only the physical location, but also the historical period, the social and cultural context, and even the prevailing weather conditions. Okay, so knowing where everything's taking place, what's going on all around the character, that's your setting, right? Putting them in a context. So a good story, I note here, is more than just a backdrop. It's a vital element that shapes the story's mood, plot, and even its characters. A good setting includes the time period, the physical location, the social and cultural environment, and the overall atmosphere of that particular scene that you're talking about. In our case, the opening scene, right? A well-developed setting should feel real and engaging, supporting the narrative and enhancing the reader's experience. Okay, so let's talk about Harry Potter as an example. So in Harry Potter, I'm using Harry Potter because a lot of people have read it. Most people have read it. A lot of people have read it, especially if you're a writer or a reader. Now in Harry Potter, the story opens in a modern day, rigid, ordinary suburban household, specifically number 4 Privet Drive, and neighborhood defined by tidiness, normality, conformity, social anxiety, and hostility to anything strange, right? This opening setting is deliberately anti-magical. Think about the Dursleys that live in this setting, right? The family that Harry lives with at the beginning of the novel. They don't want anything to do with magic because they're all about appearances. They want to make sure that they appear normal, right? So the setting's not merely a neutral place where the protagonist begins. It is a setting built to oppose the story's central promise, right? And the central promise is magic. We're going to see magic, right? And we're going to see a protagonist become this great, wizard, right? So think about how J.K. Rowling specifically, she created a setting in the beginning of the book that was everything opposed to that central promise. she did that on purpose, right? It wasn't a coincidence. And why did she do that? Well, by creating that atmosphere, we automatically have built-in conflict. Okay, we talked about conflict, the central conflict of the book, in a previous step. Go back and check out that video if you haven't already done so and you're interested. But conflict and tension between the protagonist and the antagonist is what really drives the story and gets people interested in the story, your readers, right? So if you can make your setting somehow create conflict or tension, given who your protagonist is, specifically tension and conflict for your protagonist, then right away you're going to be choosing a setting that is going to make your book more powerful, okay? So think about those things as you're completing step 7, which again is to loosely define the opening setting of your story. Okay, so now that we talked about all that stuff, let's take a stab at creating an opening setting as an example here of Dead and Breakfast, our story. Okay, so we're going to say Dead and Breakfast opens in, let's have it open up in the Dead and Breakfast. Okay, let's have that be the opening scene in the actual heart of because the Dead and Breakfast, it's the title of the book, right? So it makes sense to me to introduce that potentially right from the beginning, right? So the Dead and Breakfast opens up, the story Dead and Breakfast opens up in an let's call it a bed and breakfast for the deceased, okay? And we can say that this story takes place in modern day, in a town, let's say actually in a Greek village in Greece. And there are a number of living and dead guests commingling unbeknownst to the living guests in the same haunted building, right? So we've got, let's say, we've got our time, modern day, so we know where this is taking place roughly. If you want, you can go into more detail and say it takes place, it's opening up in the summer or the winter or what have you, right? Especially if that's going to help create more conflict. Maybe you want to open it up in the winter because it's such a cold place that it's going to be hard for your protagonist to accomplish their goal. So the setting becomes an obstacle in and of itself, right? But for our purposes, we're going to keep this simple. Modern day, so we've got our time, we've got our Greek village, right? So we know the location. We know that we're more specifically opening up in the bed and breakfast itself, right? Which is kind of like this Airbnb or scare B&B where you have living guests and dead guests living together in the same place. Now, if you want, you can add more details like I did for the Harry Potter thing, right? You can say, let's do it. In fact, let's say that the air, let's say there's tension in the air because the living guests cannot discover the dead guests, and maybe the linens in the rooms have ectoplasm on them when dead guests have been staying there. Right? So think about that. What am I doing here? I'm creating more atmosphere, right? I'm also creating a sense of what it's actually like in this physical setting, right? And I'm also creating potential conflict because if Callie, the protagonist, who's helping her parents to run this Dead and Breakfast, if it's her job to maybe change the sheets, then she's, if there's a dead guest living in one of the rooms or staying in one of the rooms, they have to know, oh, wait, there's a living guest moving into this room right now, so I have to change the sheets really quickly to prevent that conflict of having the ectoplasm being noticed, right? So think about things like that when you're working on your setting. And that's all we're going to talk about today, guys. If you enjoyed this, please consider liking, subscribing. If you want to see the next video where we talk about the next step, make sure you subscribe and hit that alert bell, and I'll see you next time.